By 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had become the longest battlefield in history. Stretching from the icy Arctic to the warm Caribbean, it was the lifeline of the Allied war effort. Every ship that sailed across carried not just fuel, food, and ammunition. It carried hope. Without those convoys, Britain would starve, and the armies fighting in North Africa and Europe would collapse. The responsibility to keep the ocean open rested on the fragile decks of merchant vessels, escorted by destroyers that hunted an invisible enemy. That enemy was the German U-boat, sleek, silent, and merciless. In the first years of the war, these submarines nearly strangled Britain into submission. Under Admiral Karl Dönitz, the Kriegsmarine perfected a brutal strategy called the Wolf Pack. Dozens of submarines prowled the shipping lanes, coordinated through radio signals from occupied France and Norway. At night, they surfaced to strike like wolves in the dark, torpedoes tearing through convoys, sending ships and men to the depths. By 1942, the numbers told a grim story. In a single month, over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping had been sunk. Sailors prayed for calm seas, not because they feared storms, but because rough weather kept the submarines away. The ocean became a graveyard where thousands vanished without a trace. German submariners, celebrated at home as heroes, believed the Atlantic belonged to them. The Allies fought back with what they had: depth charges and primitive sonar known as ASTIC. Destroyers would detect a U-boat's position, race above it, and drop dozens of canisters filled with explosives. These charges detonated at preset depths, sending shockwaves through the water in hopes of crushing a submarine's hull. But the method was flawed. Once the destroyer passed over its target, sonar contact was lost, leaving the attack to guesswork. The sea was vast, and the U-boats were... At sea, morale wavered. Merchant sailors dreaded the sight of oil slicks and floating wreckage. The sound of sonar pings became a heartbeat of survival. U-boat crews, though once confident, began to sense change. The convoys they hunted were growing stronger, more organized, and more dangerous. Aircraft patrols now shadowed the sea by day, forcing submarines to dive more often and for longer. What was once a hunt had become a struggle for survival. The tides were shifting, but not yet turned. The Allies still lacked a weapon that could hit a submarine before it vanished beneath the surface. The need for such a weapon was urgent, and out of that desperation an idea was born. One that would soon make history. The Hedgehog mortar, simple in appearance yet revolutionary in function, would emerge from that search. But before it would sink its first U-boat, scientists had to solve problems that had plagued naval warfare for decades. The path from concept to combat would be long and filled with failures. Yet within months, it would change the rhythm of the Atlantic forever. What began as a race for survival was about to become a race for innovation. The breakthrough came not in a grand laboratory or admiral's office, but in a quiet corner of Britain's Admiralty Research Establishment in 1941. Engineers studying anti-submarine warfare were frustrated by a fundamental flaw in depth charge tactics. The moment a ship passed over its sonar contact, it lost the target. The charges would then explode behind the vessel, at guessed depths, often too far to do real damage. Many submarines survived simply by diving deeper or changing course at the last second. Captain P.Q. Roberts of the Royal Navy voiced the question that changed everything. What if the ship didn't have to lose contact at all? What if it could attack while still tracking the submarine? His team began experimenting with the forward-throwing projectors, a pattern of explosives launched ahead of the ship instead of dropped behind it. Each small bomb would detonate only upon contact with the submarine, not by a timer. That meant no wasted explosions, no loss of sonar contact, and instant feedback. A direct hit meant destruction. A miss meant immediate correction. By late 1942, after countless prototypes, the Royal Navy approved a weapon unlike anything before it. It consisted of 24 small spigot mortars mounted on a circular base, angled to fire forward in a fan pattern. Each bomb was roughly the size of a fire extinguisher and filled with 35 pounds of Torpex. an explosive far more powerful than TNT. When fired, the mortars leapt from the ship in a graceful arc, landing in a precise oval 200 yards ahead. The pattern ensured that if a U-boat was within that space, it stood almost no chance of survival. The weapon was named the Hedgehog, partly for the way the launcher's protruding spigots resembled the quills of the animal. Unlike depth charges, the Hedgehog made no thunderous underwater curtain of explosions unless it hit. That silence unnerved submarine crews who had grown accustomed to surviving the noisy chaos of traditional attacks. With Hedgehog, silence meant death. At first, British escort captains were skeptical. They preferred the brute force of depth charges, a psychological weapon that rattled both crews and steel. But soon, results spoke louder than tradition. The Hedgehog's first confirmed kill came in 1943, when HMS Westcott destroyed U-581 off the coast of Madeira. The attack was swift, precise, and devastating. Reports noted that the ship's sonar maintained continuous contact until the moment of impact. For the first time, the hunter had outthought the hunted. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy took notice. American engineers studied the British designs, refined the firing mechanisms, and adapted the system for mass production. Within months, dozens of destroyers and escort ships were fitted with Hedgehog mortars. In American hands, the weapon evolved even further. Lighter materials, improved firing control, and seamless integration with sonar equipment. By early 1944, the Allies possessed something the Germans had not anticipated: the ability to strike underwater targets with near-surgical accuracy. What had once been a blind pursuit became a deadly science. The balance of fear began to shift. German U-boat commanders soon realized the danger. They reported strange attacks, clusters of explosions directly above them, sudden hull breaches without warning, and no pattern they could predict. Some survivors described hearing a raining sound just before impact, followed by metallic thuds and immediate flooding. The old evasive maneuvers, crash dives, decoy bubbles, sudden turns, no longer worked. The ocean, once their refuge, was becoming a trap. By the time the Hedgehog entered full-scale service in the U.S. Navy, its effectiveness was undeniable. Submarine losses surged while Allied convoy sinkings plummeted. The quiet weapon had begun its reign. But beyond statistics, the Hedgehog represented a deeper shift: the triumph of precision over power, science over instinct. It marked the moment the Allies took control of the invisible war beneath the waves. The Atlantic was still vast, still cruel, but now it was being watched with new eyes. Sonar eyes that could guide deadly accuracy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every limit of man and machine. The next chapter of this struggle would be written not by admirals or scientists, but by the sailors who faced the U-boats directly, in the endless night of the ocean. Inside every submarine, the war felt different. The ocean pressed against the hull like a living thing, crushing, groaning, whispering its threat through steel plates. For German submariners, the once thrilling hunt had turned into a slow descent into fear. By early 1944, the confident laughter that once filled U-boat mess compartments had faded. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months, and each dive into the dark could be their last. They slept in shifts, surrounded by the smell of diesel and sweat, their faces pale from lack of sunlight. Every ping on the hydrophone, every distant explosion, sent a shiver through the crew. Some men clenched crosses or photographs of their families. Others stared blankly at the gauges, waiting for the next attack. They had once been hunters. Now, they were prey. Those who survived early Hedgehog attacks spoke of a new kind of terror, an attack they couldn't predict. With depth charges, they at least heard the destroyer passing overhead, felt the rhythm of explosions, and knew when to brace. But the Hedgehog came silently. It arrived from above, fast, and with no warning. Then, a sequence of muffled thuds. Sometimes one, sometimes several, followed by catastrophic flooding. There was no time to fight back, no second chance to escape. To the men trapped inside, it felt like death striking without mercy. Above the waves, the technology that created that fear was remarkable in its simplicity. The Hedgehog was the first weapon of its kind designed for precision rather than brute force. Its forward-firing system allowed escort ships to maintain constant sonar contact with a submarine while attacking, something no depth charge could achieve. The moment sonar detected a U-boat, the destroyer adjusted its speed and heading, locked the target, and fired a salvo of 24 projectiles in an oval spread. Each bomb traveled independently, sinking quickly through the water, detonating only upon impact with the target. There were no wasted explosions. Every detonation signified a confirmed hit. This innovation represented a revolution in naval warfare. For decades, anti-submarine tactics had relied on chance, massive charges, wide patterns, and the hope that at least one would find its mark. But Hedgehog changed that entirely. It made anti-submarine warfare methodical, almost clinical. The weapon's success relied on precision engineering, accurate sonar readings, and disciplined coordination between sonar operators and gunnery crews. The destroyer no longer fought the sea blindly. It hunted with purpose. American engineers refined this even further. They developed synchronization systems linking sonar data directly to the firing mechanism, allowing instantaneous targeting corrections. The U.S. Navy's versions, mounted on destroyer escorts like USS England and USS Buckley, became feared for their efficiency. Crews trained endlessly, perfecting the timing between sonar lock, range estimation, and firing. Every man aboard knew his role. When the Hedgehog fired, the crew fell silent, listening for the telltale explosion that meant a hit. The absence of noise was eerie, but when it came, it was decisive. For the Allies, the tactical shift was profound. Before Hedgehog, attacks on submarines often forced destroyers to break sonar contact. After Hedgehog, contact never had to be lost. The destroyer could engage again and again until the submarine was destroyed. Convoy commanders finally had a weapon that matched the enemy's stealth. In practical combat, this meant that U-boats could no longer linger near a convoy. Once detected, their chances of survival dropped drastically. The weapon's psychological impact was as powerful as its mechanical one. German crews began reporting strange new depth charges that exploded differently, that seemed to find them no matter how they maneuvered. Rumors spread through the U-boat fleet about cursed destroyers, ships whose attacks no one survived. The myth grew around vessels like USS England, whose relentless accuracy defied belief. But the tactical revolution also demanded new discipline from Allied sailors. They could not simply bombard an area and hope for results. Success required calm, steady teamwork. The sonar operator's voice guiding the helmsman, the captain timing the approach, the gunnery officer firing at the precise moment. Each attack was a dance of precision under pressure, where one miscalculation could mean losing the target or, worse, exposing the ship to counterattack. As this new method spread across the Atlantic fleet, the entire character of the war at sea began to change. The convoy escorts, once defensive guardians, became active hunters. Instead of reacting to attacks, they initiated them. Submarines that once prowled confidently now fled at the first sign of sonar detection. For the first time since 1939, Allied sailors felt the balance tipping in their favor. The human experience on both sides reflected the deeper truth of war. That victory often comes not from sheer power, but from adaptation. The men who manned the Hedgehog were not inventors or scientists. They were ordinary sailors using a tool born from desperation and refined by necessity. And yet, through their skill and determination, they transformed the ocean battlefield. The Hedgehog's success was not just a story of technology. It was a story of human endurance, fear, and the constant search for survival amid the vastness of the sea. The men who commanded these ships would soon realize that every decision, every moment of hesitation, could mean the difference between striking first or dying unseen. Leadership during the Battle of the Atlantic was a test of nerve as much as intellect. Admirals on both sides faced the same invisible enemy: uncertainty. For the Allies, it was not only about building better weapons, but also changing the very philosophy of naval warfare. Admiral Ernest J. King of the U.S. Navy and Admiral Sir Max Horton of the Royal Navy were instrumental in that transformation. King was a man of precision and impatience, known for his uncompromising demand for results. Horton, on the other hand, was a seasoned submariner himself, who understood the psychology of underwater warfare better than most. Together, their doctrines merged aggression with innovation. Horton insisted that escorts act offensively, to hunt rather than merely protect. King supported this shift by pushing U.S. industry to mass-produce sonar systems, radar sets, and Hedgehog mortars. He knew the future of the Atlantic depended on combining technology and leadership in perfect synchronization. On the other side, Admiral Karl Donitz watched his proud U-boat fleet decline with disbelief. His early victories had seemed unstoppable. In 1942, his submariners had sunk Allied ships faster than they could be built. But by 1944, his tone in war diaries turned grim. Reports of lost U-boats multiplied, often with no survivors, no distress signals, only silence. Donitz suspected new Allied tactics but had little information. He ordered countermeasures: new sonar decoys, deeper diving limits, even acoustic torpedoes. Yet nothing stopped the losses. "The sea," he wrote, "has become hostile." He had always believed the ocean itself was the submarine's greatest ally. Its darkness, its vastness, its silence. Now, it betrayed him. The German Naval High Command at Lorient and Kiel tried to analyze captured Allied weapons. When fragments of a Hedgehog bomb were recovered from a wrecked U-boat, engineers examined its design with disbelief. It was brutally simple. No clock, no timer, no fuse that could be jammed or tricked. Only a contact detonator that responded to pressure and impact. The Allies had built something the Germans could neither counter nor imitate quickly. The U-boat captains, once legends, now operated under constant dread. Some even reported hearing the distinctive splash pattern of Hedgehog rounds entering the water, and knew their time had come. While strategy and technology shaped the conflict, the moral dimension of the Hedgehog's arrival revealed the cost of progress. In war, innovation rarely leaves room for mercy. The Hedgehog did not give warnings. It did not allow surrender. Submariners trapped below had no chance to surface or signal. They died without resistance, often within seconds. When Allied sailors later examined oil-slicked waters after an attack, they felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. Many were haunted by the silence afterward. No debris, no survivors, just bubbles rising from the deep. Letters from destroyer crews described the unease. "We knew they would do the same to us if they could," one sailor wrote. But it felt like watching the ocean swallow men alive. The moral burden of technological warfare was becoming clearer. Progress meant distance, not just physical, but emotional. The Hedgehog removed the human element from killing. The destroyer never saw its victim. It only saw a blip vanish from a sonar screen. In the heat of battle, this was efficiency. In reflection, it was tragedy. The German submariners bore the other side of that emotion. Diaries recovered from sunken U-boats tell stories of despair and resignation. One officer aboard U-744 wrote, "We fight the ocean more than the enemy. We hear them above us, like gods deciding who lives." For these men, courage was not in victory but in persistence, diving again and again into hostile waters, knowing the odds were against them. By 1944, only the most determined or fatalistic crews volunteered for patrols. Young men barely out of school were sent to command boats that had little chance of returning. The glory once associated with the U-boat arm had turned into a slow, collective funeral. The moral paradox was complete. On the surface, Allied sailors celebrated each victory, each confirmed kill. Below, German crews died unseen, believing their struggle was noble even in defeat. Both sides were victims of the same machine, the relentless logic of war that rewards innovation and punishes hesitation. The Hedgehog symbolized that shift in the purest form. It was not a weapon of rage or revenge, but of calculation. It marked the beginning of modern warfare's most defining characteristic: precision without compassion. Leadership had guided its creation, technology had perfected it, and fear had spread it across oceans. The psychological weight of this change was felt from the highest admirals' offices to the smallest bunkrooms at sea. The Atlantic no longer belonged to courage alone, it belonged to science. Yet the war was far from over. As the spring of 1944 approached, the U-boats still prowled in desperate missions. The Allies were preparing for something larger, an invasion that required total control of the seas. In those final months before D-Day, the Hedgehog would prove itself not just a defensive tool, but a decisive weapon of dominance. And at the center of that story stood one ship, a destroyer whose name would be whispered with awe and fear among German submariners: USS England. In May 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its most decisive chapter. The Allies had finally gained momentum, and at the heart of this turning tide was a small American destroyer escort, USS England, DE 635. She was a modest ship by appearance, just 306 feet long, manned by a crew of 200 sailors, built not for glory, but for protection. Yet in less than 2 weeks, this unassuming vessel would write one of the most astonishing records in naval history: the destruction of 6 German U-boats in 12 days. Her weapon: the Hedgehog. The first encounter came on May 18, 1944, south of the Solomon Islands. Intelligence reports had detected a line of German submarines sent to reconnoiter Allied shipping in the Pacific. At 1:25 a.m., USS England's sonar operator picked up a faint echo, steady, rhythmic, unmistakable. The ship's captain, Lieutenant Commander C.A. Smith, ordered the crew to battle stations. Engines roared to full speed as the ship closed in. The sonar ping grew louder, sharper. When the range hit 250 yards, the gunnery officer fired a full Hedgehog salvo. 24 projectiles streaked forward, vanishing into the black water. Seconds passed. Then, boom, boom, boom. The crew felt the shock through the hull. A column of bubbles and oil surfaced moments later. U-16-7 was gone. The following morning, the sea was eerily calm, but the crew of USS England had no time to rest. Another sonar contact appeared. Another submarine. Again the ship moved in, steady, disciplined. Another salvo. Again, multiple detonations. 2 submarines in less than 24 hours. Word of the feat spread quickly across the fleet. England can't miss. Sailors whispered over the radio waves. It wasn't luck. It was precision. The Hedgehog H had turned anti-submarine warfare into mathematics. Range, bearing, speed, and depth computed into lethal accuracy. By May 24th, USS England had sunk 4 U-boats. Her sonar operators barely slept. Their ears rang from hours of constant listening. Each attack followed the same rhythm: detect, track, close, fire, wait. The waiting was the hardest. Sometimes 30 seconds of silence stretched like eternity before a single explosion told them they had struck true. Each hit was final. No survivors, no counterattack. German submarine commanders were stunned. Radio messages from Dönitz's headquarters ordered the group to scatter, but it was too late. The Allies had learned to coordinate surface and air patrols perfectly. American aircraft forced U-boats to submerge, where Hedgehog-equipped destroyers waited. The deadly trap closed tighter with every encounter. The 5th U-boat, U-1224 tried to fight back. It fired 2 torpedoes at USS England, but the destroyer's captain anticipated the attack and veered hard to port. Both torpedoes missed. The crew responded instantly, locking sonar contact again. A single Hedgehog pattern was enough. The explosions came fast and violent, and within minutes, the submarine broke apart. Only a few pieces of wreckage floated to the surface. By the time the 6th submarine was detected, the crew was exhausted but determined. They had become experts in a new kind of warfare, one that demanded patience, calculation, and nerves of steel. On May 31st, England's sonar picked up another contact. The captain ordered an approach at reduced speed, maintaining silence. They fired 1 salvo. No result. Adjusted position. Fired again. This time, a chain of explosions shook the sea. The crew knew instantly. Another U-boat gone. In 12 days, USS England had done what entire fleets had failed to do in months. 6 submarines destroyed, each with surgical efficiency. Admiral Ernest King, rarely given to praise, issued a formal message. There will always be an England in the United States Navy. The Hedgehog had proven its worth beyond any doubt. For the German Navy, the news was devastating. 6 submarines meant hundreds of trained men lost, along with months of preparation and vital intelligence missions. The Kriegsmarine's morale plunged. Donitz's headquarters received the after-action reports with disbelief. No conventional explanation could account for such accuracy. For many German submariners still at sea, USS England became a ghost ship, a symbol of inevitable death. They called it the destroyer that never missed. But beyond the statistics and strategy, something deeper was unfolding. The Hedgehog had changed not just tactics, but the psychology of the Atlantic War. Submariners no longer feared long, drawn-out depth-charge attacks. They feared silence. The quiet before the impact. That was the sound of death. It stripped them of hope, of the illusion that skill and courage alone could save them. Technology had rewritten the rules. In naval command centers, the Allies watched the numbers shift. U-boat kills rose sharply. Shipping losses plummeted. The convoy routes that had once been death traps were becoming safe lanes. The turning point had come, not through grand fleets or massive bombardments, but through the cold precision of a forward-firing mortar and the men who trusted it completely. The victory of USS England was more than a tactical success. It was a signal that the underwater empire of the Third Reich was collapsing. The Hedgehog had found its perfect stage. And as the Atlantic War entered its final phase, the terror that had once belonged to the Allied merchant sailors now moved to the men of the U-boat fleet, who waited in the deep for a weapon they could neither see nor escape. For the German submariners who faced the Hedgehog, the final months of 1944 felt like drowning in slow motion. The ocean, once their shield, now betrayed them. Every sound, every creak of metal, every murmur of machinery seemed to echo through the depths, calling destruction toward them. Inside the steel hulls of U-boats, the atmosphere was unbearable. The air was hot, stale, laced with diesel fumes and fear. Men whispered in the dark, their eyes fixed on pressure gauges, listening for the distant pings that signaled a destroyer nearby. They could hear it before they saw it. The high-pitched sonar pulses, steady, cold, methodical, creeping closer. The captain's voice broke the silence. "Dive deeper!" The engines roared. Ballast tanks hissed. The submarine slid into darkness. But the sound did not fade. The destroyer above stayed locked on them, unrelenting. Then came the splash, a strange rhythmic pattern of impact striking the water's surface. The crew exchanged terrified looks. It wasn't the familiar cascade of depth charges. It was something else, quicker, lighter, deadlier. The Hedgehog had found them. Moments later, the explosions began. Not a rolling thunder, but sharp, surgical detonations. One after another, they tore through the pressure hull. The lights flickered. Valves burst. The boat tilted violently as seawater flooded in. Panic spread faster than the flooding itself. Some men tried to seal compartments. Others prayed. Within seconds, the submarine was gone, crushed by its own element. Above, the destroyer's crew listened for confirmation. When the explosions stopped, silence filled the bridge. Then, through the sonar headphones, the operator's voice came. "Contact lost." They knew what it meant. Another U-boat destroyed. Across the Atlantic, scenes like this played out again and again. Between March and June 1944, Allied records confirmed the sinking of 47 German submarines. An astonishing number for such a short span. The Hedgehog, paired with improved sonar and radar, had turned the tide completely. German wolf packs no longer prowled in coordinated assaults. They scattered, isolated, hunted down one by one. Each successful attack strengthened Allied confidence and deepened German despair. The statistics told the story of collapse. Where once every submarine sunk cost the Allies dozens of merchant ships, now the ratio was reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. But the human toll of this technological triumph was staggering. Each U-boat carried around 50 men, sailors, officers, engineers, many barely out of their 20s. Their deaths were often instantaneous, their resting places unmarked. Families in Germany received the same short telegrams. U-boat missing, presumed lost with all hands. For the surviving submariners, the psychological weight was unbearable. Many reported nightmares, trembling hands, and uncontrollable panic when sonar pings echoed through the hull. What had once been a profession of pride became an ordeal of terror. Admiral Dönitz, a submariner himself, visited his bases at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire in the summer of 1944. He found them eerily quiet. Gone were the cheers that once greeted returning crews. Now, the pens were filled with half-repaired boats, their crews dead or broken. The commanders who remained were gaunt, hollow-eyed, exhausted. "Our boats are dying in silence," one officer told him. Dönitz understood that the tide of war had turned irrevocably against him. He wrote in his diary, "Our enemies fight with instruments of science. We fight with courage and faith. The first will always outlast the second." For Allied sailors, however, the victories carried their own burden. The Hedgehog gave them results, but it also distanced them from the horror of what they had done. Unlike surface battles, there were no cries, no faces, no survivors. Each confirmed kill was a sonar echo vanishing into silence. Some captains celebrated. Others simply stared at the oil slick spreading across the water, wondering who had been below. "We saw nothing," one sailor from USS Whitehurst wrote. "Just a patch of bubbles. But we knew 50 men had just died." Still, the necessity of war left little room for reflection. Every submarine destroyed meant hundreds of merchant sailors saved, convoys that reached their destination, and the vital flow of men and material continuing toward Europe. In that calculation, the Hedgehog's efficiency was beyond question. By the end of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic, the struggle that had lasted nearly 5 years, was effectively won. Allied convoys crossed the ocean with growing confidence. The U-boats that once haunted those routes were now rare, isolated, desperate. The few that remained at sea often never returned. The Kriegsmarine tried new technologies, snorkels, acoustic torpedoes, radar detectors, but none could undo the devastation. The turning point had come not from a grand naval battle or massive fleet engagement, but from a single invention, a weapon designed for accuracy over strength, precision over chaos. The Hedgehog had done what depth charges, mines, and bombs could not. It erased the advantage of invisibility. In war rooms in London and Washington, reports from the Atlantic Command spoke of unprecedented submarine destruction. Commanders realized they had crossed the threshold into a new kind of warfare, one dominated by data, detection, and exactness. The Hedgehog was more than a weapon. It was a philosophy of modern conflict. The idea that control of information and precision of strike could overcome any numerical disadvantage. For the submariners of the Kriegsmarine, that realization came too late. The seas that had once been their kingdom had turned against them. And as 1944 drew toward its bloody midpoint, the same Atlantic waters that once carried fear to Allied hearts now carried hope, the assurance that the way to Europe and to victory was open. By the summer of 1944, the silence over the North Atlantic was not peace, it was extinction. The once traveled under constant threat, began crossing the ocean almost routinely. Merchant captains no longer waited for the sound of torpedoes in the dark. The seas, once ruled by the gray wolves of the Kriegsmarine, now belonged to the hunter fleets of the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy. The effect rippled through every aspect of the war. With the shipping lanes secured, Allied logistics surged to unprecedented levels. Weapons, fuel, food, and men poured into Britain in preparation for Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy. Without control of the Atlantic, that invasion would have been impossible. The Hedgehog, though just one weapon among many, played an invisible role in making D-Day a reality. It gave the Allies certainty, the confidence that their fleets could move freely without fear of ambush from below. Inside Germany, however, the atmosphere was suffocating. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, received reports daily from the BDU headquarters in Flensburg. Each message carried the same grim pattern: U-boat missing. Crews were vanishing faster than replacements could be trained. The Kriegsmarine's technical divisions worked frantically to develop countermeasures, new coatings to absorb sonar, decoy devices to mimic engine sounds, and the snorkel to allow longer submersion. But nothing could match the combination of Allied radar, sonar, and Hedgehog precision. By late 1944, Dönitz was forced to change his tactics entirely. Instead of sending out wolf packs, he ordered submarines to operate alone, surfacing only at night and spending most of their time deep underwater. But even that offered little safety. The Hedgehog had changed the rules. Unlike depth charges, it didn't rely on guessing depth. It struck where the target actually was. This meant that evasion was nearly impossible once contact was established. Psychological collapse foe. And yet, even as Allied victory spread across the seas, the true cost of the U-boat war was only beginning to be understood. When the war finally turned toward its closing act in 1945, the Atlantic was quiet again, not because peace had returned, but because there was almost no one left to fight beneath its waves. Of the 162 German U-boats commissioned during the war, more than 70 to 80 were destroyed. Around 30,000 submariners, 3/4 of the men who had once been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, never came home. Their bodies lay entombed in the steel coffins scattered across the ocean floor. For many families in Germany, there were no graves, no remains, only the cold certainty of loss. In the shattered cities of the Reich, these men were remembered as heroes, symbols of sacrifice and endurance. Yet even among their surviving comrades, the pride was tainted with bitterness. They knew how completely the balance of power had shifted. The submarines that had once held Britain hostage were now relics of a bygone age. Dönitz himself, when appointed Hitler's successor in April 1945, was a leader of ghosts. His beloved U-boat arm was dead long before Germany surrendered. Meanwhile, in Allied command centers, a quiet satisfaction replaced years of anxiety. Charts that once showed thick clusters of enemy contacts now displayed empty seas. The convoy routes from Halifax, New York, and Liverpool ran without interruption. The merchant losses that had reached catastrophic levels in 1942 dropped to their lowest point of the war. The numbers were staggering. By mid-1944, the Allies had lost only a fraction of the ships that once vanished each month. For every U-boat sunk, dozens of merchant ships survived to deliver food, tanks, and ammunition to Europe's front lines. The Hedgehog's role in that outcome could not be overstated. The weapon's success reshaped naval doctrine. In the post-war years, when Allied divers began exploring wrecks along the Atlantic seabed, They found the remains of dozens of U-boats in perfect condition, sealed time capsules of a lost war. In some, coffee cups still rested on tables, logbooks lay open, and control panels remained intact. Everything inside was frozen at the moment of death. The divers described an eerie stillness, as if time had stopped the instant the Hedgehog's charges struck. It was like stepping into a tomb. One wrote, "They never had a chance." In memorials across Germany, in Kiel, Hamburg, and Wilhelmshaven, stone tablets list the names of those who vanished at sea. There are so many that the inscriptions seem endless. Yet among historians and naval engineers, the story of the Hedgehog is told not as a triumph of destruction, but as a triumph of adaptation. It showed how the Allies learned to fight a war of innovation, not by matching courage for courage, but by turning intelligence into survival. By the war's end, the balance of power on the seas was irreversible. The age of the submarine ace was over. The men who once stalked the Atlantic in stealth and pride had been outmatched by science itself. And as the surviving submariners stepped ashore in a defeated Germany, many could only whisper what they had long known at sea, that the ocean, which had once been their ally, had turned into their executioner. Yet amid all the loss and silence, one truth remained. The Hedgehog had not just sunk submarines. It had buried an era. When historians speak of turning points in the Second World War, they often name Stalingrad, Normandy, or Midway. Yet in the cold, invisible depths of the North Atlantic, another revolution took place. One defined not by armies or flags, but by silence, precision, and the relentless march of technology. The Hedgehog mortar was small, almost unimpressive in appearance, but it carried within it the power to end an empire's dream beneath the waves. For years, the German U-boat had symbolized mastery of stealth and courage. It was the unseen predator that dictated the rhythm of the sea. But courage alone could not compete with innovation. The Hedgehog marked the moment when warfare crossed a threshold, when science, not heroism, decided survival. The seas that once echoed with torpedo strikes and sinking convoys became quiet, not through peace, but through control. The submariners who perished were not villains. They were men trapped in the machinery of war, victims of a struggle far greater than themselves. Their bravery was real, their suffering immense. Yet their defeat signaled something larger, the end of the age of romantic warfare. From that point forward, war would no longer depend on instinct or valor, but on data, sensors, and precision. In that sense, the Hedgehog was not merely a weapon. It was a prophecy. It foretold a world where battles would be fought through signals and algorithms, where machines would think faster than men, and where victory would be measured in detection before destruction. The Atlantic, once an arena of chaos, had become a proving ground for the warfare of the future. Even today, deep beneath the rolling waves, the wrecks of U-boats lie undisturbed, silent witnesses to the moment when human ingenuity overtook human endurance. They rest as iron reminders of what it cost to learn that progress and devastation often sail the same course. For the submariners who wept in the dark as the Hedgehog closed in, the war ended not with surrender, but with silence. And in that silence, the modern world began.